Great day to you, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day two of the ILO Caribbean Resilience Symposium. I am Trisha Tarada, and I'm glad to be your host for today. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. We appreciate the time and effort that you've been sharing with us. As we say yesterday, living in these extraordinary times doesn't mean that life should stop. We only step our game up. And yesterday, we were able to pick up a lot of good insights from our presenters and panelists, and even from our participants. It was a great start in the symposium, and we hope to carry on with that today. But before we start the sessions, let me just run through you the agenda, the things that are in store for you today. Earlier, we had two separate sessions, two separate panel discussions, one for the workers group meeting and another for the employers group meeting. And right now, we're beginning with the first session for today. That's happening at 11 a.m. At 1 p.m., we will have another session about the labor market policies for recovery and the role of public employment services and public employment programs. As we get a hang of this virtual symposium, allow me to share with you a few reminders. Just as in a face-to-face symposium, it would be great to get to know each other and to address each other properly, even though we may be miles apart wherever you are. And we can simply do that, by heading over to your participants tab down on your screens. You will see that. Please click the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom window. Then the participants panel will pop up on the right side. Please click more and you will see the tab for renaming. Edit your name and click rename yourself with your organization and country information if possible. We have right there an example for you. When you're done with that, of course, day one as was very huge success because of the brilliant ideas from our ministers, panelists, and presenters. And of course, because of you, our dear participants, there was a wonderful exchange of ideas and questions. And let's keep that going on for day two. And by now, you know the drill. If you have any question, or if you have ideas or insights, please type them in your chat box. The tech team and moderators will pick it up from there. Right now, why don't we do a very quick activity? Kindly type in your chat boxes the name and the city that you are in. And while you're doing that, let's just have a quick recap of yesterday's discussion. Basically, we've learned that there is no one linear solution as we navigate through these extra challenging times, and rather it takes actually a variety of approach. The digitalization, the virtual platform, the technology are very promising, but it's important that to be able to fully maximize it, we must address the gaps. Bottom line is, according to our speakers, according to our brilliant panelists, it takes a whole of society approach to achieve social protection. It's important that no one gets left behind, even if the pandemic accelerated the challenges. All right, we're receiving a few responses. We're sending our highs and hellos wherever you are right now. And we're hoping that you're doing great because we are going to have a full day ahead, a lot of brilliant discussions coming right your way. And of course, even if this is a virtual symposium, let's make it a bit more human by turning your cameras on. If you can keep that going, that would really be great. We would appreciate that very much because, talking with your cameras off is like talking to this guy on the right side of your screen. So we would really do appreciate it if we can make it a bit more human. If you do have any concerns or questions, please email Ms. Rizal Milville, the National Project Coordinator. If it is tech related, or if it has something to do with their virtual session, please do contact the pandemic support team. We have with us on standby Kayla Venzen, Karen Pan, and Juana Kanchan to help you out. And if you have colleagues who are not able to join us here via Zoom, we are live on a few platforms. Please feel free to share our live stream link on social media. We are on YouTube. please check out International Labor Organization, but make sure that you click the one with a check mark beside the name just to make sure that you are on the right page. And we're also on Facebook. Please type in International Labor Organization dash Caribbean office. We are again live on those platforms, especially for your colleagues who are not able to join us right now. So first up, we are going to be talking about the challenges and opportunities in gathering research and data collection, contribution to comprehensive disaster preparedness and recovery processes. And to usher us to that, we have Mr. Diego Rey. He is the Employment and Labor Market Policy Specialist of ILO Decent Work Team and Office of the Caribbean. Please take it away, Mr. Diego Rey.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. We have virtually the whole Caribbean represented. We have over 70 participants so far who logged in. I'm Diego Rey. I'm the Employment and Labor Market Specialist at the ILO Office for the Caribbean. I wish to welcome you to this event and thank you for your interest. Today's session will deal with the challenging and interesting topic of research and data collection contribution to comprehensive disaster preparedness and recovery processes. It builds on one of the activities of the ILO research project, being a competitive call for financing research issued in collaboration with the University of West Indies and the Inter-American Development Bank. Such process eventually led to publication of 2 working papers and 1 blog entry on the impact of extreme weather events on labor markets and on the performance of small and micro enterprises. As a parallel and compelling topic, today's session will also look at how the COVID crisis impacted research and especially data collection, zooming into answers by development partners and national statistical institutes. We will have presentation from 3 practitioners, followed by an interactive Q&A sessions. For those willing to contribute to the discussion, I would like to kindly ask you to type your questions into the chat box. If time allows, you may be given the floor, or we will simply read the question out loud. We will strive to answer and to ensure all comments and questions are addressed during the session. Now, before getting into the presentations, I would like to propose a quick poll to get a grasp of today's representations within the audience. What type of institution do you work for? We have 4 options: ministries, academia, statistical institutes, civil society or social partners, and others. If you could kindly specify in the chat. We have about over half of the participants who answered so far. We are reaching 100% response rate quickly. And about 50% of the participants come from the ministries, followed by civil society and academia. In terms of others, I see employers organizations, employers federations, international organizations, I would call insurance company. Great. I think we have a fairly good idea, and we have representatives from a lot of different areas and branches. Do you see the results? Yes, thank you. Okay. Ministry of Education, employers organizations, workforce development. Okay. Great. Okay. So thank you. Having said that, we can move on with the session. The first presenter is one of the leading academic researchers on the topic of extreme weather events and socioeconomic impacts in the Caribbean. Dr. Eric Strobel is professor in climate and environmental economics at the University of Bern. He's also a part-time research professor at the University of Birmingham and external professor or fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute in Trinidad. He has published widely on topics related to the interaction between the natural environment and the economy, labor market functioning, industrial policy, and foreign direct investment. The particular focus of his research in recent years has been how extreme climate events such as hurricanes have affected Caribbean economies. Today, he will share with us few of the lessons learned throughout his career and share relevant recommendations for the future. Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diego, for that nice introduction. Okay. So yes, as Diego indicated, I'll be talking about essentially the data and research challenges in trying to measure the impact of shocks in the Caribbean. So, I mean, I'm not going to say very much in terms about frequency of large shocks, but as you all know, the Caribbean is one of the regions in the world that's probably frequent to most of the shocks, particularly with regard to natural disasters. But of course, now during the COVID situation, we're also talking about other types of shocks in this regard. And I think particularly for a lot of these island economies, or some are not island economies, but small economies, it's important to try to understand the economic nature of these shocks, right? Because if you can understand the economic nature of these shocks, then you can start thinking about potential improved ex ante and ex post mitigation policies that will essentially increase the preparedness and the way that economies can better deal with these sort of shocks that are going to continue coming, whether they're pandemics or natural disasters or exchange rate shocks or whatever. From my own knowledge of the kind of specific literature related to the Caribbean, I still think there's a lot of gaps of knowledge that still exists in this regard. So what I really want to do in this presentation is try to broadly kind of identify the reasons for the gaps, provide recommendations for them, I mean, my own subjective recommendations, and kind of give you essentially some food for thought here. Okay, so just so you know where I'm coming from, because I don't understand a little bit of things that I talk about. So I'm an empirical economist. I work essentially with data, in particular trying to look at shocks. I have a particular interest in the Caribbean, in part because I've been employed there, in part because I'm currently still affiliated. Anyway, I have a long history of it with there. And in my own work, I've worked with many different Caribbean data sets, from macro level data to micro level data to survey data, using other types of third-party data like satellite data and these things. But before I go into the specifics of what I want to talk about today, I think the main caveats, well, there's two caveats. The one that I put on the slide here is that I'm primarily familiar with the English Caribbean. So in terms of the French département, I don't know too much about, or the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, I haven't really worked with them. And secondly, of course, any sort of insights or views that I give here are to some extent going to be subjective and based on my own experiences in terms of the research projects I were involved in, the people I've worked with, and these sort of things. So everything has to be taken with a bit of salt, but hopefully you can get something out of my own experience. Anyway, so as a basic framework, so you can see my sort of thinking when I think about the kind of data sets that would be ideal here, you can think of a shock like a hurricane. And ideally, if you wanted to know what that impact of the shock is, whether you're talking about at the macro level, so at the island level, or if you're talking about the micro level, looking at households, firms, individuals here, you'd like to know what the pre-shock context was, right? So you'd be able to say, were households prepared, were firms prepared, was the government prepared? And you'd like to know what the post-shock context is, right, in terms of data. And here we can talk about short versus long, medium term. Now, lots of the analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, is done on the long medium term, but for those of you who've been directly involved in terms of ex post disaster mitigation, it's really the first couple of days and weeks that can matter a lot in terms of what the long and medium term matters here. And there, of course, there's not going to be much information or data. So let's look at the sort of existing socioeconomic research on the Caribbean. So there's, I think, a good bit of macro, long-term, medium-term effects in terms of the macroeconomy, relatively well researched, that is, because particularly in the last 20 years, macroeconomic data has become much better for Caribbean islands. It's become much more harmonized, so it's comparable over these. So I'm particularly talking about GDP or looking at debt. So there's lots of studies, including my own and others, that have tried to look at various things in this regard here. There's some macro data on labor markets, remittances, and migration, which are, of course, important aspects. But the quality there is, of course, much lower in that regard, because it's been hard to harmonize the data across different island economies and other economies in this regard. But I think, even with regarding these kind of data shortages, one could say it's fairly well researched. Now, that doesn't mean that we understand what happens when some shock like a hurricane hits in all aspects, but at least there's much more insight compared to 10 years ago. Now, in terms of short-term impact, so I'm talking within the first few months or weeks here, and when I talked about macroeconomic impacts, I'm really talking about at least a year, 5 years, and these sort of things. There has been some recent advances. In part, this has been because short-term monthly data has become more available. In particular, here I'd like to commend the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank that I think after advice from the IMF started collecting from about 2000 onward lots of monthly data, which has made things more possible in terms of analysis, so we can really look at what happens in the short term. Tourism data is now available on a monthly basis across the Caribbean. So there's a lot more recent advances in that regard. There still could be more for the wider Caribbean, but I think at least there's making some headway. Now, I think where the real problem is in terms of the Caribbean is in terms of microeconomic data. And here I'm really talking about household data, firm data, and these sort of things. And even if we don't look at the short term, if we're just talking about the long, medium term here, the analysis that's available is very little. I've done some studies, there's a few other studies, and mostly they focused a little bit on household income and employment, etc. And the basic problem behind there is, if you think back from the graph I was telling you before, if you really want to see what the impact was on households, then you have to have some sort of information before the shock hit. So let's say before the COVID crisis, and then afterwards. And then you'd have to try to compare. If you want to learn something from historical data to say something about, was there a lot of sort of informal insurance mechanisms in place and these sort of things. And if you look across the Caribbean, at least in the English Caribbean, the only island that has put considerable effort into creating sort of longitudinal data, so where you can at least follow households over time or follow individuals in the labor market over time is Jamaica. A lot of the other islands don't have that. I mean, Trinidad and Barbados have labor force surveys that you can kind of construct a panel in that regard. But other islands, let's say like St. Lucia, has only periodically had a survey of living conditions, and I think recently had a labor force survey. So that's the real problem there. There's just no data that exists, right? And really there should be some sort of, I think, investment in that if one wants to rely on individual level data to tell us something about this here. Now, when we talk about the microeconomic short term, we have almost nothing. And we can see that a little bit. I was involved a little bit with the World Bank now with the COVID, where people really wanted to know, what was the short-term impact? And they had to quickly do surveys, but of course they had nothing to compare it to ex ante. So these are kind of where the stance of the literature is. So I think the challenges here, and I talked a little about is first of all, in terms of data. So as I said before, we really need data sets that follow economic agents over time, realizing, of course, that this is going to take effort and money and something that has to be persistent in this regard. So I'm talking about labor force surveys to do these for more of the other islands, the survey of living conditions. If we look at Jamaica, that has been fairly successful. Firm surveys and any other sort of surveys that might be an interest in this regard. But I think those are the main ones. We need info related to ex ante and ex post shock behavior. So if you look at a lot of the sort of labor force surveys and SLCs that are implemented, some of them do every once in a while have a question, let's say, about what is the impact of shocks and hurricanes. So Jamaica had it after Hurricane Gilbert, but then never again. if you look at the recent one in 2016 by the St. Lucian government, it has a question there specifically about shocks, natural disasters and other types of shocks. But in general, they seem to be sort of modules that are just implemented every once in a while. And a lot of these questionnaires were taken over, of course, from questionnaires done for other countries in the Western Hemisphere, but I think they really have to be at least adjusted for the specifics about Caribbean island economies that are important here, right? I think another thing is if one really wants to say something for the wider Caribbean, there has to be consistent data across the Caribbean. So Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad, as I said before, have labor force surveys. Jamaica has consistent and periodic survey of living conditions. But I think apart from sort of, indirect efforts by the World Bank and other organizations to collect these, there is no community-wide effort here. Now, CARICOM does try to collect these data, but it doesn't really sponsor these things here. And scarce data is really for the smaller islands. So if you look in the Eastern Caribbean, almost no SLCs have been implemented. There's no essentially consistent labor force surveys done. So it makes it difficult to try to think of policies and understand what's going on here. And I think in that regard, we just need collaboration of statistical agencies with the research community to see what would be required in terms of information needed for, let's say, academically based analysis, and with NGOs as well here. The second challenge here is essentially in terms of research. So I think the quality of research, I first worked at UV in, I think it was 2000 here. The quality has increased substantially. I think it's because a lot of people went abroad, because there's more push for academic research. I still, in my own experience in the English Caribbean, the incentives are not 100% always there. That is, sometimes it's just the quantity of publications that are done, that reports done for consultancy, these sort of things sometimes count more than academic research. Of course, it's a matter of data access, how much data is available for local researchers to use, facilities in terms of commuting. So, these things kind of go hand in hand. So I see a lot of improvement, but I think there could be more there. But I think there's movement in that regard. The one thing that I've noticed, at least in my own experience, that when it comes to research partnerships for specific projects, they tend to be very dichotomous. So you have the statistical agencies doing stuff with the NGO, where they collect data that the NGO is interested in, and then it just stays within that relationship, is either not used or at least not accessible to the academic community. NGOs may work directly with universities without involving statistical agencies, so not using the experience in terms of collecting the data. Or statistical agencies work with universities, and sometimes then, of course, the financing may be relatively low here. So I think all these sort of things mean that one is not really taking advantage of all the possible benefits that could be done. Thirdly, consultancy firms. So consultancy firms, one has to realize, and this is not me knocking against consultancy firms, they have their own incentives, right? It's essentially, they're based on trying to make money out of projects. Sometimes, or often, in my experience, that means there's a reduction in the quality. And if there's not some sort of third party that can ensure that the academic quality behind the work being done is very high, then of course there's no incentives this year. What I've also found, which I think is unfortunate, that consultancy firms, respond to proposals, for call for proposals from statistical agencies or the NGOs, and then when they get essentially the grant, they then third-party outsource to local academics at a much lower price. And I think these sort of things one could really cut out the middleman. But I do think there's role for certain things for consultancy firms, for quick reports and these sort of things with less academic nature. Okay, so this brings me to the recommendations then, and not to run over time. So I think the main thing is data collection. I think things are getting better, but really, this is not something one can necessarily and should really blame at the local statistical agencies, because collecting data takes, of course, time. That means finances. That's not always there here. They may need logistical support in collecting newer types of data sets and these sort of things. So I think that's where particularly the NGOs can play a very large role. And I know a lot of them do. I know the IDB and ILO and the World Bank do collect a lot of data sets that are being used for whatever projects they're interested in this. I think in that regard, there could just maybe be more collaboration with the view of having these data sets, not just collecting in SLC because COVID happens, but continuously collecting these and trying to get them running on their own here. I think there could be a lot more cross-national data collaboration. So as CARICOM has, I think, set up a data bank, but if there was more cross-national collaboration across the statistical agencies directly, I think they could gain a lot from each other in terms of the experience. Particularly Jamaica has a lot of experience in that regard that I think they could share. I think multilateral research collaborations would be great. That means rather than being its dichotomous, that it could be, trilateral or even more than trilateral, where statistical agencies, NGOs, and universities work together in that regard. So if there's a particular types of project or question they're interested in that does need some academic work, I think by drawing on the experiences in all three of these agency groups have a lot of experience that can be shared. I think it could just be a much better, research output in that regard. When there might be some skills that, let's say, local universities don't have, and this is not in any sense knocking the quality of these, what we're really talking about is, there's not that many universities here, and we're talking about the wider academic community, where, of course, you have hundreds of universities in the US and Europe and these sort of things. I think involvement of non-Caribbean researchers could be important here. And I think one of the things that I've seen, particularly in the ILO and IADB, and to some extent in the World Bank, that also helps is if there's a project involved, one of the contingencies should be that there should be some sort of academic working paper that comes out of it, where that's then kind of at least get some academic feedback to make sure that the research and the data sets are used both in the academic community rather than just as a consultancy report that is sometimes hard to get one's hands on. So I think these are my sort of general, to some extent subjective recommendations that I think could make answering the question about shocks, how we deal with them, what policies would be good, what informal insurance mechanisms are, could make that a much more promising research area with a lot of potential in this regard. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the broad and sincere presentation. I hope it raises questions and comments from the audience. We will address those at the end of the third presentation, but if you have any, please start to type it in the chat box. Thanks a lot. I'll move on to our second presenter, Dr. Barwoman Mendoza, who may also be familiar to most of you. He is the lead economist in the Caribbean Country Department of the Inter-American Development Bank. He has led research and data collection projects in various countries, including Caribbean ones, and research on topics including the effects of different information and communication technologies on agricultural profitability, child labor, academic performance, prenatal care, neonatal health. Today he will share with us the IADB experience with a specific focus on the response to the data needs following the COVID crisis. Dieter, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diego. I'm going to share my screen. I think, okay, share screen. Please confirm me if you can see my screen now.
It's coming up. Yeah, now we can see.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. First, thank you very much also to Eric's presentation, because I think my presentation will be mostly complementary to what he has said, that I fully agree with. I'm going to speak a little bit about the topic that was assigned for today of data collection, specifically within systemic shocks, that the ones we're, for example, living right now with the COVID situation, but will also apply to other type of shocks, right, to natural disasters and so forth. And I will focus on some of the experiences that we have had lately, but I will also refer to the broad issue of data collection and availability within the Caribbean. Okay, so in general, right, what is the key objective of data collection and research? Having relevant, timely, representative data that could answer not only research questions within an academic perspective, but that rigorously answered questions be useful to the design of more optimal policy based on evidence, right? This issue becomes, it is already difficult, but it becomes more difficult, right? Within systemic shocks like natural disasters or the current pandemic, right? However, what I would like to show today is that there are exercises that could be of data collection exercises that when done within a forward-looking approach, it could make this much more feasible. So first, referring to the current crisis that we're living in. So when the crisis evolved, right, through a systemic crisis, let's say about March, April last year, of course, all the social distancing measures were put on, and most of the ongoing surveys, right, like labor force survey, living condition surveys speaking in the Caribbean, of course, were stopped because most of them are face-to-face. So there was a concern to continue collecting data to kind of not only measuring the shocks, but also monitoring the situation. So the examples that we implemented in the Caribbean first were online surveys. So we put together a set of online surveys and implemented across all of our IDB member countries, of course, including our Caribbean member countries. And the experience, ex ante, we didn't know how it would work, right? These are surveys that are voluntary, so there's a lot of issue on self-selection of who is responding. Of course, it's not a meditated or premeditated representative sample that is being selected, right? So it was just a test. So we put this out, and the response was quite remarkable. So across all our member countries, there were above 250,000 responses. We did this in partnership with Cornell University. And within the Caribbean, I mean, focusing on our IDB Caribbean member countries, I'm speaking about Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname, and the Bahamas. At a minimum, each country will have around 2,000 responses, valid responses. It was a kind of comprehensive survey, and we have put it, it's publicly available. The report is also publicly available within the IDB, so the microdata is publicly available. And for example, one chart that I like a lot is the distribution of, for example, home responsibilities within the lockdowns, right? And you can see how women were extremely highly facing the burden, right, of home responsibility, even though both were at home, right? So this, I think, this will not be a surprise, and this is for our Caribbean member countries. The second effort is phone surveys, and this is one of the examples of some kind of forward-looking data collection exercises that could be useful for this type of situations. So these phone surveys were done in a way that we could really target a representative sample. How we did? So we did this in Barbados and Suriname. Some time ago, between 2016 and 2017, we sponsored a representative comprehensive surveys of living conditions in Suriname and Barbados around 2016, 2017. And within this data collection, we also collected for those individuals who consented, and these were more than 90% of the sample, contact information like cell phone numbers, specific addresses, and etc. We didn't know whether we would do a panel follow-up of the sample, but we did just in case, in terms of a forward-looking necessity will come about. And this came in the crisis. So we already have comprehensive information of these scientifically selected representative samples, and also poverty calculations based on consumption, on objective consumption. So we know households who are extremely poor, non-poor, and non-extreme poor. And we were able to call them just after the pandemic emerged as a systemic shock between March, April, May. And we're able to do, of course, phone surveys has to be short, less than 8 minutes, because if not, you lose the people. And we're going to ask specific questions. But the beauty of this is that because you already have a previous engagement with this person that you have, who have been interviewed in person, then the response rate of a phone call coming to ask some further questions is higher. So it's about a response rate of above 80% with respect to the base sample, which is a lot, right? Once you start looking at responses rate, typical responses rate of a phone survey that may range between 20 and 30%. And this is a representative sample that, of course, we had to reweight because of this non-response rate. These phone surveys in Barbados, 2 rounds, and in Suriname, 1 round. All the microdata is also publicly available in the IDB website, so that you can merge the living condition survey at the household and individual level with all these follow-ups by phone. And you can track, for example, labor market outcomes before and after the pandemic. And that's basically what we have been working on. And importantly, and this is complementing what Eric said, it's true that many Caribbean countries do not exercise regular data collection activities, being Jamaica the one that is more advanced in this issue. But it's also true that there are a lot of data in administrative registries that are stored there and that could be exploited further. I am speaking about, for example, education registries of examinations that are stored for many years, criminal records that are stored in police offices, or national insurance scheme records that collect a lot of information monthly of labor market activity at the individual level, or, for example, civil registry that records all basically fertility and live births and deaths that happen in the country. So all of this information exists, is being stored continuously, but it's not matched across individuals, across many agencies, because they still store in silos. We have done some work in Barbados. For example, we were able to match all educational records, primary, secondary, CX examinations at the individual level with the 2016 Survey of Living Conditions to explore what is the long-term effect of the quality of education on long-term outcomes, like, for example, educational attainment, labor market participation, and fertility decisions. And this is a paper that is an IDB working paper. It's also forthcoming in the Journal of Human Resources. And also in Trinidad and Tobago, we're able to match many administrative records, like National Insurance Board records, like the criminal police records, like the civil registry records, and all educational records, to also explore the long-term effects covering the full population of the quality of education on long-term welfare. And this is currently also a working paper which is published, and you can check all of this in the IDB website. So merging this type of survey data and administrative data, I think it's a powerful tool. And one example is, for example, that is going to be coming out soon, for Barbados, we merge educational records going back from the 80s with this COVID telephone survey to explore how the quality of education provides labor market resilience. And what we're showing is that within the hard times of the pandemic, where unemployment went up a lot, really having long-term human capital acted as a strong buffer in terms of preventing labor market losses and also being able to weather better the storm. And this is kind of novel evidence that you can do combining administrative records and this timely collection of information, which was already informed by a previous face-to-face survey. So it's merging a lot of types of efforts to have precisely what Eric was saying. You need information before, after, and some sort of exogenous variation to exploit whether a buffer existed or not. So this is one of the examples that we were able to do. And this also, I think this slide is a little bit off, but what I want to show, this is, for example, in Barbados. So we have information across the different socioeconomic groups, low income, middle income, high income. In January of this year, in April and in June, right? So this is the share of households, for example, who were unable to meet their financial commitments. Because we did these telephone surveys, we can track this through the pandemic. You can see how the low income segment exponentially grows their hardship, right? Then the middle income, from January to April, they grew a lot, but in June, they were already improving. And also the high income. This is income not measured at these times. This is income based on the previous survey, so before the pandemic, around 2017. And you see how this ex ante already measured vulnerability has been realized across the pandemic. And finally, the recommendations, I think timely and accurate data is key for policymaking, because these large systemic shocks need information before or after to identify vital targeting relief that should be targeted according to the necessity, right? And this is even more important because the effects of systemic shocks could go beyond the short run. And this is an example, for example, of a paper that we recently published of the effects of hurricanes on women who were bearing a child in their womb. And then we see how are the effects of these hurricanes that were suffered by these children where they were still unborn, but 5 years later in terms of early childhood development indicators like weight for age. And this is basically the effect, which is around 2.5 standard deviations, which is a lot, for those kids who were affected. And you see how these kids were either in boom before or after the hurricane, they didn't see any effect. So this is kind of evidence that this is a causal relation between this disaster suffered when the kids were not still unborn, that is reflected even 5 years later when they were a kid of 5 years old. And this would likely reflect also into long-term productivity, right? So, and this is important to bear in mind because you need data to show that and to justify policies that could provide safety nets for these vulnerable populations and in critical stages of life development or of human capital development that could impact in the long-term productivity. So it's not only an issue that the systemic shock will have some short-term effects, of course, but it could also be translated into long-term productivity and therefore growth, right? So, and finally, the availability is key. Of course, we need the data to be readily available. And on the IDB side, that's what we try to do. Every survey, every data collection, we put the microdata anonymous, of course, publicly available. And here I would like to highlight, for example, the work of the Guyana Labor Force Survey, which actually started in 2017 with assistance of IDB and also with the collaboration of ILO. We were there for the launch in 2017. And there was a commitment of the statistical agency that they will continue doing this on their own with the capacity acquired, and they have done. And what I would like to highlight, for example, if you go to the website, all the microdata is publicly available, even including until 2020. So I think this is a powerful example and a milestone for Caribbean countries because it's very important for this data to be available so that researchers could start exploring questions with this data into more rigorous academic settings that could serve shaping the decisions in terms of policy. So it's basically having data publicly available is basically getting you free labor of people who would be exploiting this data to answer questions rigorously that will also eventually will serve as an input for evidence-based policy making. So that's the message I would like to give, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Dieter, thank you so much. Extremely interesting, your presentation, concrete examples, very hands-on recommendations. We have some questions already coming in the chat. Thank you. We will address those after the next presenters. Who is our last, but certainly not least presenter, Mr. Halim Brizan is the director of the Central Statistical Office of Grenada, where he worked in different capacities since 2008. He does the in the previous presentations and in the chat as well. It's interesting to note that Grenada was one of the few countries in the Caribbean which managed to conduct regular labor force surveys during the COVID pandemic. And this is remarkable. And also I wanted to mention that within the Eastern Caribbean, Grenada is one of the countries, and also St. Lucia run labor force surveys on a fairly regular basis during the past year and a half. Alim's presentation will allow us to draw some helpful lessons about how to tackle the issue of data production in the aftermath of a natural disaster, building on the experience from the COVID pandemic. Alim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Diego, and pleasant good morning to all. My presentation, as Diego indicated, is based on data collection in crisis situation, particularly labor market information, and highlighting Grenada's experience with data collection, especially during this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And this can also be pertinent for the post-disaster situation. So here's the presentation outline. In the interest of time, I wouldn't go through it. And just by way of background, the information presented on this slide here speaks to the fact that Grenada is a small island developing state within the Caribbean region. And with this comes certain socioeconomic and environmental challenges. In terms of high unemployment, especially among youths, relatively high poverty rates, high external debt to GDP ratio, large balance of trade deficit. We're also susceptible to external shocks and limited fiscal space. Our country is also highly dependent on tourism, which is a major foreign exchange earner for us. And we're also prone to natural disasters and climate-related events. Our disaster risk includes the tropical cyclone, storms, hurricane, and we have experienced those in the past, the most severe one being Hurricane Ivan in 2004. Also, we're highly prone to floods. We do have off the coast of Grenada an underwater volcano, Kikamjeni, which is a threat to us. And also we're in the earthquake zone. I think it's important to fully assess the impact of COVID, to look at our pre-COVID situation. And the next two slides will highlight our weaknesses going into the pandemic and our strengths. So in terms of our weaknesses, our sample frame was not developed so that CATI surveys could be used as a survey option. And by CATI, I mean computer-assisted telephone interviewing. Our sample frame is the Population and Housing Census visitation records. And we collected, although we collected telephone numbers in the last Population and Housing Census in 2011, those numbers were collected on the census questionnaire itself and not linked to the visitation records. So our sample frame did not have those numbers. Secondly, on average, just over half of the old samples of labor force survey had telephone numbers. So also, there is no dedicated staff for field supervision at our office, and this function is normally performed by the permanent staff of the Census and Survey section, who also has other responsibilities. There's also limited statistical research capacity, something that we need to work on. And there's no dedicated public relation officer, and PR is highly important to improve the results of, to improve the response of survey undertakings. And also we have an outdated statistical legislation, the Statistical Act of 1960. In terms of our strengths, and I must say that we have really capitalized on our strengths and the opportunities to be able to ensure the continuation of our survey program during this pandemic period. So our strengths include, we have field staff contracted on a full-time basis, thanks to the vision of the government to have this budgeted on the government's recurrent expenditure since 2018. And since 2016, we have been using CAPI surveys, CAPI technique, computer-assisted personal interviewing in all our households, placing us in a better position to administer surveys remotely. Sufficient old samples of labor force surveys with telephone numbers is available for CATI surveys, that is the telephone surveys. Also, sufficient labor force quarterly surveys was done to allow for pre and post-COVID quarter-to-quarter comparison. And I must clarify here that we have been doing labor force surveys. Well, we revitalized our efforts since 2013. We have been doing annual labor force surveys, and we started doing the quarterly labor force surveys since 2018. So we have been making steady progress in that regard. Also, we have a well-trained data processing and IT team and survey management team to ensure the effective coordination of the post-COVID survey undertaking, and also the team is highly, highly committed. And lastly, the support from Statistics Canada through the Project for Regional Advancement of Statistics in CARICOM was commendable. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on our survey operation, the conduct of our labor force surveys have been adversely affected. So the fourth quarter of 2019 was conducted via telephone because of the pandemic, and we were a bit late in conducting the fourth quarter survey, hence the reason why we had to resort to telephone. And the response rate was extremely low since we did not use an old sample with telephone numbers. We were unable to carry out a first quarter survey for 2020 as a result of the delays in the fourth quarter, and also we felt the need to spend time in preparing for the second quarter, where we would have had to make many adaptations to our questionnaire. In the second quarter, no face-to-face interviews were allowed, given the social distancing protocol. However, in subsequent quarters, this was relaxed and we started using a multimodal approach with CATI and CAPI surveys. Telephone interviews resulted in a low response rate as a result of missing phone numbers for a large proportion of our households, and not necessarily as a result of refusal from the respondent. The questionnaire was actually longer, and in all our efforts to shorten the questionnaire, it was still longer due to the addition, and we felt the need to add a COVID module and COVID-related questions. However, I would not say that this has affected the response rate. In terms of our sample selection, we had to break our sample rotation cycle so that we use old samples where telephone numbers were available so that at least we can have a representative sample. And one improvement is that we did a monthly location of the sample for the quarter to give a better reflection of the quarter using a reference week for each month. So at the end of the day, the result of the quarter is representative of the entire quarter and not just one reference week for that particular quarter. We also managed to conduct a labor market needs assessment last year. We actually started before the onset of the pandemic. However, the COVID delayed the continuation of this survey, and as a result, we used the opportunity to recalibrate and adapt the instrument. So we included a COVID-19 module, and this is an establishment survey, so we did include a COVID-19 module. Due to the protocols, some business establishments were temporarily closed, especially in the hotel and entertainment industry, and some business closed down operations permanently. This survey was done mostly via the telephone, and the closure of businesses, I would say, affected the response rate. It could have been better, despite the response rate being relatively high. So this next slide shows the response rate pre and post pandemic. And if you realize, it is just highlight the statement that I made before, that the low response rate was as a result of the lack of telephone numbers and not necessarily as a lack of non-response. I like some general challenges, and I think the first one here speaks to the entire CARICOM countries, that shifting priorities of government lead to reallocation of statistical resources, reducing budget for data collection. And the second one particularly relates to us in terms of the use of the old samples resulted in respondent fatigue, since in a significant number of cases, the same households remain in the sample for subsequent quarters. And the fact that there is no dedicated public relation officer for continuous advocacy to highlight the importance of data for recovery from crisis, this normally impacts any survey undertaking. Also, state of emergencies, lockdown, and curfew limits the time interviewers and statisticians have for data collection and production, slowing the entire data production process and affecting the availability of data. Some recommendations and specific support to address those challenges. So, number one, greater advocacy to promote the importance of statistics in times of crisis, particularly for governments to see the importance of statistics and evidence-based planning in the restoration process and in transforming the economies after crisis, and importantly, appealing to them to retain statistical budgets and allocate or source additional resources for the collection of statistics. And also for the general public to be encouraged to participate in surveys and to be able to, and we should be able to demonstrate to them how their participation can help and even how it has helped our country's development. Also, statistics, which is a public good, should be promoted as an essential service, and statisticians and persons employed within the statistical system should be added to the list of essential workers. Also, I am making an appeal for greater funding and technical assistance for countries to be able to adapt survey operations in times of crisis. Also, support is important for countries to be able to build sample frames with telephone numbers and email addresses assigned to each household. And this is important for building resilience in our survey operation. And as our countries prepare to conduct the National Population and Housing Census, it now is a good time to ensure that this frame is developed. Also, being able to access telephone numbers from telecom providers, research, but I would say that greater research is required on how data quality issues can be minimized for this approach to be a viable alternative to a viable alternative sample frame. Also, equipping the National Statistical Offices with the ICT infrastructure to support CAPI and CATI surveys, and that includes the tablets. We are making a plea for SIM-enabled tablets, laptops, desktop server, even imagery and GIS software. Research also in using other data sources, and we hear about administrative data sources, also big data and other data sources to reliably predict labor market variables and indicators for the labor force survey, especially when an actual survey cannot be done. Building and testing.
Hold on a second, Alim. Can we please let Alim finish the presentation? Alim, we cannot hear you. Alim?
Halim, we lost your audio.
Alim? Alim? We lost your audio. Alim, can you hear me?
Mr. Diego, I don't think he can hear us, but I think he's already done with the presentation. So thank you very much to Mr. Halim.
Okay. Well, Alim, we'll get back to you. I hope you can reestablish connection. We have few questions which I would like you to address. We have let me try to give the floor to the people from the audience who ask questions or comments. We will try to do this very shortly, please. 1 minute each for asking your question out loud, and we will see who amongst the presenters wishes to answer. And in the meantime, we should be able to make it in the due time. So I will first give the floor to Mr. Augustus from the Waterfront and Allied Workers Union in Dominica, who had a comment. Thank you. Mr. Augustus.
Hi, Mr. Augustus. Could you please turn your mic on? I think you're on mute.
Am I on now?
Yes, there, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I want to thank you, well, thank the presenters for the information that they have delivered to us. Unlike yesterday, I am able to make a contribution. What I want to do is in that fashion. I'm going to react to the presentation of Eric in terms of asking a question, and in relation to the last BRISM. In relation to BRISM, I want to state that I have to compliment Grenada for having regular labor market force surveys, which is absent in my own country. I think the last one that we had was in 2011. And there was a statement that I could associate with, and that is timely and accurate data is critical for decision making. And I'm saying so because of the fact that I am regular in the whole question of collective bargaining. And therefore you need information, regular information, so as to justify whatever position that you're taking. But when that is absent or unavailable, it makes it difficult. And as we were discussing, I found myself in a situation where I was requesting some statistical information from my statistics department. And I'm ashamed to say that the information was completely unavailable. We were asking information in relation to employment levels, pre-COVID and post-COVID, and that we couldn't get from our statistics department. When I asked the question why this is so, we were told that this labor force surveys have not been carried out ever since 2011. So that creates a serious problem for me. Now, in terms of all three of the presentations today, it is rather important that the collection of statistical information is used to the benefit of all, not only the labor movement, but also the employers. And if one has to define research, one could come to the conclusion is the accumulation of the information that is available and the need to use it to the benefit of the parties. It is clear now, having operated at the level of the region for some time, that the majority of unions, except I think for Barbados, the Barbados Workers Union, Guyana, the Guyana Labor Congress, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica, those would probably have established research departments. But the majority of the other unions do not have that because we do not have the capacity to have one dedicated solely in terms of the collection of statistical information and research. Statistics in Dominica, as I indicated, is not always available and most of the time lacking. I did give an example of the whole question of the labor force surveys that one could utilize in terms of getting some information and dealing with what we are experiencing. When there is no information in terms of the main sectors of the economy, it puts the trade union movement at a disadvantage, because we would like to know what is the contribution of organized labor or workers in general to that particular sector of the economy. When one looks at Dominica, one could say that the main pillars are tourism, agriculture, manufacturing, and services. But you cannot get information in terms of disaggregation of the labor force in those areas, where one could show the contribution of the male and the female in those areas. So I would have to make this suggestion that in the trade union movement, there is the need to have someone dedicated for the collection of such information. Admittedly, most of the general secretaries of organized labor have had to double up to be able to get the statistical information and do the research that is necessary to justify the position of the union in any area. So we would have to probably review our position in terms of making the necessary financial proposition to have such a person. But I believe that the ILO can help in terms of assisting unions that do not now have a dedicated research officer for that person to be trained. And in those countries like Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica, that some of the workers or the dedicated person that is identified could have some attachments so that they could develop that capacity in order to be able to assist the union. I know that the ILO have in fact assisted in the past in terms of the labor market information system. I would think now that they would have to seriously look at the question of developing the capacity of unions to be able to have a research officer so that we could make a better contribution to the whole question of the development of the unions. But let me also indicate that
Justus, if you could please come to the end of your intervention.
I am coming to the end. I'm coming to the end. That to put some of the researchers as essential service workers could create a problem in certain countries, and definitely so in Dominica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gustus. On behalf of the ILO, we note the research, the request and the problem, underline it in terms of capacity to research, to analyze data in order to uphold the specific positions and promote sound policy making. Thank you for your contribution. I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Ali, who had 3 questions. I think it's best if you could raise them in the shortest amount of time if possible. Mr. Ali from Trinidad and Tobago, if I'm not mistaken.
Mr. Ali, please unmute. I think your mic's off. Thank you very much. Oh, he's unable to speak, Mr. Diego. I think he
Okay,
just
sorry.
there.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to make an interface. There's just a few things I would have highlighted in the chat, which I thought I should bring to the attention for discussion. I listened with interest with respect to the need for multilateral level of engagement by various agencies, statistical agencies, research enterprises, governments, NGOs, etc. And I wondered whether or not there should be some form of agreement to manage the process by which data collection and the reporting systems are done primarily for the sake of labor reforms in the region and especially for labor market trending. As we talk about future needs and we identify the futures for employment. The other issue that I had raised had to do with getting the voice of policymakers in the dialogue. Quite often, agencies that do research, and I lead an agency and we've done some surveys in our sector, and we are doing more surveys to look at the needs of our sector from every aspect, from the customer aspect, financial aspect, the workforce, etc., in regards to that particular sector. When we share the reports with relevant policymakers, there's sometimes very little interest, or perhaps there are other issues that they're finding more important. And so there's a lack of dialogue to look at how the data could assist in decision-making to strengthen or support this sector. And the third issue that I had raised had to do with, I have worked in other contexts in the Middle East, and in the context, there's been a lot of discussions about using bots, robots for facilitating conduct of surveys. And there have been some very good studies done and practical exercises that have been conducted where bots have been used and connected to social media, to LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram, to interface with persons who actually participate in surveys. So they're not questionnaires, they're bots that are asking the questions, persons respond by a voice, and the data is collected and reported in a database. So I just wondered the extent to which we are thinking about the future when we talk about automations, we talk about digitization, we talk about the future where artificial intelligence is concerned. Are we considering that in our discussion, or are we pivoting to old methods and methodologies that may not work for the current times we live in? Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. So I will give the floor to our panelists to answer. Also, perhaps consideration made by Mr. Augustus, and I think they reflect, Halim, partially the need for having a communication officer and advocate for data collection and ensuring budget for statistical offices. So Eric, Dieter, Alim, any reaction to this first set of questions? Eric?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Some of them are not really, well, they're not really my expertise, but I certainly think in terms of trying to get the more multilateral cooperation, there has to be some sort of incentive behind it. So linking it to some sort of legislation or mandate, or NGOs, universities, and statistical agencies committing themselves to, if a project is to be done, that there has to be all three players involved, I think is the way to go. Yeah, one has to think about how to create an incentive system that this is done on a consistent basis and continuously. So I think that's an excellent point.
Thank you, Eric. Alim, Dieter?
Yes, if
Alim.
I may, and the speaker who spoke to the issue with the lack of surveys being done in Dominica, and I must say, it's probably no fault of the statistics office, because in Grenada we had the same issues, right? But I think what we have working for us is that our Prime Minister is a statistician, and he has been championing the cause for statistics for a very long time. He's also the CARICOM champion for statistics. So it is easy for me to make recommendation in terms of improving our data production and see some sort of traction. And I think what we need to, in improving this situation, what we need to do is find more champions for statistics throughout the region and in your country. Persons who can communicate the effectiveness of using evidence-based planning in terms of improving development outcomes, right? So also it could be a capacity issue as well, and attention has to be placed in ensuring that that skilled, qualified officers, there's a training program to develop officers so that they would be able to implement these survey undertaking. Because it's not, we work to our way to be able to do that, and to capitalize on any opportunity that is available for capacity building. And to
how are you?
hello?
I am good.
Respond to the issue of getting policymakers involved. This is very important, and I think this is something lacking in our statistical system. And also it is also a capacity issue as well, because we know that we need to do more user-producer dialogue to really explain to the public what the statistics mean and how it can be used, how it can be interpreted, because I realize that basic definition that the population may not understand about labor force, as in terms of who's unemployed, who's not working, right? The definition of what employment is. So there's a lot that has to be done, but we just do not have the capacity, because of the volume of work to be done, to really host these user-producer dialogue. But it's absolutely important, because at the end of the day, our statistics supposed to be demand-driven. And the issue about the bots and the online surveys, that well, in terms of the labor force survey and the actual methodology, it is difficult. There could be some quality issues where that is concerned, because basically this is similar to self-enumeration. I don't know if you will get the bots to explain certain methodology that or probably probe when the respondent gives you a vague answer. For example, when you're thinking about industry coding and occupational coding, there are certain details that we need to capture, so that the enumerators and the office can actually code the industry of that employed respondent. So I stop here. But it is a good idea, and it is something that be explored for simpler surveys, and be not complex surveys as labor force surveys.
Thank you, Alim. Dieter, perhaps you are the one with most up-to-date information about the bot. Anything to add?
So yeah, I think I will agree with Mr. Halim. For example, so all these bots, online surveys, and so forth, right? The issue is that all of this is self-selected, right? Basically, this is not a premeditated sample that you can say, okay, this is a representative sample, okay, and that's an issue. The other issue is that the depth of information that you could collect with these methods is limited, right? It's not like the rich information and more detailed information, and Mr. Halim was saying, that is usually prone to be collected in a face-to-face survey, right? Having said that, in the experience that we had with the online survey, is totally self-selected, but when you are able to have some reliable information, that could be like the census, or also collecting, so you can have reliable information of rich demographics that could be obtained from a different data source, could be a representative sample or a census, and you could also ask for those questions within the online survey, right? So having that, you can reweight the data using the let's say the probability of answering a survey, right, based on a consistent representative survey, and based on those demographics that you could also collect from a self-selected survey, and kind of try to correct for this self-selection that is being over when you just put out an online survey, right? So this kind of work more or less well. So we're able to compare, for example, in Barbados, the results from this reweighted approach of the online survey versus the statistics that you obtain from the representative telephone survey, which was done calling like a previously in face-to-face interview sample, right? That was scientifically designed to be representative, and it worked well. But you don't always have this to compare and to say, okay, this is working well, right? So and the information that you can collect, and I have to say that again, in these methods is more limited. Maybe very few questions on specific things that you would like to track, like in a high frequency basis, right? So I think the approach could be complementary, but I think by no means that should replace like a formally established labor force survey with a quarterly rotating panel and so forth, right? I think that even in developed countries, I mean, kind of in the US, right, the current population survey is going on and goes on, even though there are other means of data collection. There could be some hybrid approaches where to minimize cost. For example, if you have a part of the sample who is very familiar with digital technologies, you could first try to interview that part of the sample over the phone or by internet, right? And then the rest of the sample that might not be familiar or might not be responding, then go and look face to face to already those who didn't respond digitally, right? But then at the end of the day, it's just one sample, such that part of the sample was interviewed using other technologies, and the other part of the sample face-to-face, but you're applying basically the same questionnaire. That could be an approach that could minimize costs, right? Yeah, there are a lot of things to explore there, right? So that would be, I think, my thinking about that.
Thank you very much. What I would do now is give the floor to some of the questions that were raised before in the chat. So specifically, Mr. Sabarosh, Mr. Wilson, and Mr. or Miss Luke. Then I will just launch a question related to a comment from Miss Campbell from Jamaica. And finally, to conclude, I will give the floor to Miss Singh and Sang, who raised her hand. Thank you. So, Mr. Sabarosh, Ronald Sabarosh.
Hi, Mr. Diego. Can you repeat that for us? Who's the person again?
Mr. Ronald Sabarosh.
Mr. Ronald Sabaros. But anyway, if he's not here, I'll just be reading out his question. He's asking, will there be some agreement in place for the collection of data in other islands, which will be helping formulating plans and programs for the islands? End of question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to get this a bit more interactive, but I think Alim, maybe you could update us on this. We are actually collaborating right now on the OECS survey questionnaire for the new labor force survey. But leaving that aside, I wanted to ask if there is any joint effort to collect data inter-country within the Caribbean you could update us with.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I'm not aware of any joint effort for data collection in terms of assisting countries, but I could speak to the fact that at the OECS level, there's the OECS Living Standards Measurement Committee, which all OECS Director of Statistics is part of. And the responsibility of that committee is basically to assist in designing harmonized labor market instruments, right? And also testing these instruments. I think one of the greatest challenge for a national statistical office in the implementation of a labor force survey is funding. It always goes back to funding, regardless of how much training that the officers within that office receives. But without the money to do the survey, it cannot be done. And you know, we need to do some cost-benefit analysis to see that yes, there is great benefit to having this data in terms of what the country could gain or the funding that they probably can get for certain developmental activities, and also that there's a cost to not having the data as well, because of the resources that could be used that might be used inefficiently as a result of not having this information. But I can tell you from our experience, the reason why we were able to develop to that capacity is because of the same OECS program, which was also supported by the ILO. When they designed that harmonized tool, we were able to benefit from technical assistance and funding from the European Union. And as a result, we were able to fund, the EU was able to fund several rounds of our labor force survey until the government was able to adopt it. And first, it was part of the capital expenditure. And then in 2018, it's part of the recurrent expenditure. So basically, the important thing is that you produce the first round, find funding to produce the first round. And once the government can see the data and the benefits of the data, then that probably can motivate them to fund that program. The important thing is that the data is available at the time it is needed to make the decisions that are necessary.
Thank you very much, Alim, for this reply. I would just invite, there are a couple of new comments. We will take them at the very end. I would just invite the public not to type any more questions. We don't have any more time. I was interested to hear from Mr. Alim, who mentioned internal conflicts as an issue in collecting data after natural disasters. If we could elaborate about that shortly. Mr. Edward Wilson.
Diego, sorry, do I have to respond? I didn't hear the...
No, let's give him the floor quickly, because I'm not sure what these internal conflicts also within trade unions mean. It's helpful to
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. Thank you.
Okay. We've been talking about data collection, so that we know the position with the labor force, the workforce. If there is antagonism between the government, the employers and employees, then information that's supposed to be passed on, it will not be. But before I go further, I should quote the scripture which says, a house that is divided cannot stand. And so this lack of data collection may as well be the lack of inputs, the relationship, the communication between those major players. But you have a second problem where there, and we don't want to say it, but even in my country, Dominica, there are concerns that we have among the existing trade union internal conflicts. And we don't want to talk about it. We can, because, for example, if there is a good relation, and let us say any one of the trade unions get information, what I would advise is that they call the other trade unions and they pass on the information, but that doesn't happen. Everybody stand on their own. So all of these impede the whole idea of data collection, and that is one of my concerns that I have. So no matter how much information and assistance that we receive from ILO, it will not help us, not until we address those two major issues. One, between the relationship between the government, the employers and employees, as well as the relationship between the trade unions in Dominica. That is what I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We take these occasions not only to present, but also to receive feedback and country level experience. So this is duly noted. I wanted to ask perhaps all of our speakers, but Halim and Dieter, I think you might have something to say. There was a comment from Miss Campbell from Jamaica. Data collection can be hampered if countries do not have strong data protection legislation. To what extent do you think this is an issue in the Caribbean? I guess it's about attrition or non-response rate. Would the absence of data protection legislation be a meaningful obstacle?
Hello. Well, this is not my area of expertise, but I think from what I have seen, the data protection legislation of the Caribbean countries that I have worked with are quite strong. And I would say that it should be true. I mean, when you publish microdata, it has to be it has to go through a very rigorous process of identity protection, right? So nobody is able to recognize from the data an individual household or an individual person. But after a good anonymization process, it is also true that any microdata could be shared for research purposes, right? And that this is done in many countries. And now, for example, I would say an example of that I mentioned of the Guyana Labor Force Survey, where the microdata is being posted regularly in their website to be downloaded by everybody, by anybody, right? So, and I guess, of course, without a good legislation or without good protocol of anonymization, and then this data, and if this data starts to be be serving to identify individual household or individual persons, then people would not trust and might stop responding to the national service. So for sure, without a good protection, this will immediately have a negative effect on not only on the protection of the persons per se, but also on the likelihood of future responses rate for the service.
If I may,
sorry, Alim, I will skip your response to this because we are really short on time. We have Miss Singh who raised her hand. There is another Mr. Ethelbert who also, if we have time, Mr. Ethelbert, we would come to you. First, Mr. Singh and Mr. Spencer, I will reply to you privately, similarly to Luke. Hazeluk or Miss Hazeluk. Okay, Miss Singh, it's your time. Thank you.
A pleasant good morning to all. Thank you very much. There are just two short points
I just took it. I wasn't doing anything. I was tripping in the bomb.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll make my points short. There are two short points. One, I like the idea of the hybrid approach that was suggested to data collection by one of the presenters. And I would like to suggest that maybe the statistical institutions can get together and look at the possibility of, having, developing a strategy for remote data collection that is given real time, because one of the challenges policymakers face is the time lag in data collection that we currently experience, and therefore the timeliness of policy responses become a challenge. Of course, there are many issues that will have to be considered in developing such a remote data collection real-time strategy, inclusive of some that has been raised before, including, the security, cybersecurity issues, legislative ability to get persons to be able to respond, so to improve the response rates, etc. And so that's one of the suggestions. And the second one is really seeking information. I'm not sure, or I have not come across any studies that has been done on the issues of unpaid work. As we know, unpaid work and paid work are intimately integrated in our economy. And with COVID-19, I am not sure if we have been measuring what has been the impact or the increase contributions of unpaid work. I mean, we've definitely seen the demand for unpaid work increase in terms of things like cooking, cleaning, childcare, elderly care, etc. Not sure if any, and this is probably an open question to anyone who has done work in this area, and what are the percentage of women that has had to carry this extra unpaid work that we are looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for being short. Dieter, I think you might be the best person to reply to this. I guess in your survey of living conditions, this is captured somehow.
I would like to respond to some
I
interesting
was coming to you after. Yeah, go ahead.
Peter could go first.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alim.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. Just to respond quickly, and I take note of the point of a strategy for the remote data collection, and I think that is that the discussion on this has already started at the level of the Standing Committee of Caribbean Statisticians as a way of building resilience in our statistics data production. And interesting that you raised the point about the measurement of unpaid care work. Grenada is currently doing a pilot survey with UN Women, and to pilot this that there's a particular questionnaire that would allow us to report on the SDG indicator for that, which we have piloted in the first quarter of this year. And we are now looking at the results, analyzing the results on paid care and domestic work. And it is our intention, well, not is our intent, but we are adding that particular question in our census questionnaire as well, because we see the importance of this in being able to account for the burden of care on everyone, both men and women.
Thank you, Alim. Dieter?
Yes. No. I think this is totally right, but there are caveats to take into account also. So, in experience, at least with the countries we have been working on, developing these methodologies of remote data collection is not something that is done overnight, right? It requires a lot of new capacities, capabilities, and expertise that has in general not been developed so far. So it has to be considered very carefully, very coordinated, and very conscious that there are different issues, skills, systems, and also different scopes for how the instrument will be administered, because the instrument or the questionnaire that you usually do face-to-face, in most cases would be very difficult to implement by phone, for example, or by internet. So it has to be a review of this so that it is actually prone to be collected via those methods. So it's something that goes beyond a decision of okay, I apply my current instrument via the phone. That typically would not work. It has to be a lot of adaptation. What Halim was mentioning, I was glad to hear. Choosing the CI/TI instrument that will be used, also the software that you would use to store the data. There's a lot of also a lot of issues of more stringent data confidentiality protocols, because some countries may be collecting phone numbers, but I think most of the ones that I have looked and worked with, for example, in the regular labor force surveys, phone numbers or personal information was never collected. So if we're going to go to start using these methods, then of course this information will need to be collected and is going to be stored somewhere, and this makes even more important the protocols for protection of data. So there are a lot of issues to think about, but it's as I mentioned before, are alternative methods that should be considered because they are also useful.
Thank you very much, Dieter. So we are over time. I would like to ask Eric if he has any final comments with respect to any of the questions raised. Mr. Joseph, you mentioned some important issues about the weaknesses of the unemployment rate as definition, and how we should prioritize on employment rate and labor productivity. Yes, but there are also countermeasures about that. The international labor standards have been updated. We are now measuring work together with employment, which are two different concepts, and this relates also to the issue of unpaid work, which was raised before. Or by any means, employment rate tends to be a better indicator in times of crisis to measure the exact extent of the crisis because of the problems with the unemployment rate. Anyway, having said that, Eric, any last comments, and then we will finish. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Diego. I mean, in terms of the data protection legislation, I don't know much about that either. I think one way around it, particularly if other institutes or, let's say, university academics want to use the data is to use confidentiality agreements, which one sees in most European countries, in the US as well, particularly for data that there might be some sensitivity to it, right? So I think that's one possible way, but for that, of course, one has to, essentially get a precedent for it and have some legislative backup behind it. But I think that's one possibility, to make data in particular cases available that might be more sensitive. But other than that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank everybody for their attention. I'm really sorry we are over time. We have another session on a different topic. You are invited to join right afterward. This was a very interesting session. A lot of challenges raised, but interesting, a lot of potential solutions, starting with the, let me mention the hybrid approach to combining administrative data and survey data. Continuing to the incentives to research, incentives to collaboration between the public sector, the academia, and the NGOs. There is a lot which could be done. We as ILO will be here to continue assisting governments, employers, and workers of the Caribbean. Thank you very much to all the presenters, and I will give the floor to our chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diagare, for moderating that very informative session. We sure got useful ideas we can ponder as we move on or as we adapt to the challenges that we are facing. For now, I'd like to invite everyone to head on over to your chat boxes as we do another round of feedback polls. Your thoughts, your input matter to us. So please do click in. What do you think about today's session? So we're learning how crucial data and research are, especially timely and accurate data at that in decision making. But there needs to be a lot of fine tuning, as our speaker said, and balancing act between access and data privacy. It's also great to know that data gathering is evolving with newer tools and instruments and technologies. So as you do your feedback polls, as you vote, let me run down the agenda for today, the remaining agenda for today. So we are done with the parallel group meetings earlier, and we just finished the first session for day 2 of our ILO symposium. After the break, we're going to be discussing about labor market policies for recovery, the role of public employment services and public employment programs. That's happening at 1 p.m. Right now, let me usher you in to a 10-minute break. But please remember that to be back on time. You can freshen up, take your screen breaks, rest your eyes for a bit, grab something to eat. But please be sure to be back after 10 minutes. The rest of you can continue answering the polls if you haven't yet. Thank you very much. See you after 10 minutes.